Hello, everyone. Hello, good morning for some of you, good afternoon for others. I am delighted to be here with you and the group of experts that will join me for this interesting conversation today. My name is Vanessa Dezen. I am an energy reporter in Europe for Bloomberg News, and I welcome all of you. I see there are many people entering and to join us in this conversation. I'm very happy about it. So we are here to talk about what has been called by many as the challenge of the century, the fight against climate change. And it can be this generation's legacy or not. That will depend definitely on how we're going to be able to handle it, right? And methane emissions, at least until now, seem to be the missing part, a piece of this puzzle. It's the missing part of this conversation, but it's also a very good opportunity, and that's what you're going to be talking about today. So, at least 25% of today's global warming is driven by methane from human actions. And one of the largest methane sources is the oil and gas industries, as you know. Today's study from the Environmental Defense Fund showed that cutting methane emissions now could slow the rate of climate warming by 30%. And that's what we're talking about, right? A UN climate study to be released tomorrow points to methane mitigation as one of the greatest tools available nowadays to address the climate crisis. That shows the importance of what we're talking about here. We are going to discuss how the industry can reduce the dangerous gas emissions and what role financing has in this fight. So I want to thank you all again very much for attending this event. Thank you also, Deborah Gordon, Senior Principal at Rocky Mountain Institute, with whom I will have a Q&A section very, very soon. And thank you to the panelists also. Our discussion will take place right after the interview with Deborah. I am excited about what you're going to learn from all of you. I hope everybody is also excited. And now, before we start, I'd like to ask you all to mute your microphones if it's possible. We would also be very happy if you want to share ideas in social media, so please do. And if you tweet about the event, use MiQ handle at MiQ_org, and please tag hashtag methane emissions. That would be very helpful. Please get involved, ask your questions, send your comments using the chat function, and we will be happy to get some answers for you during the panel. I think it's gonna be exciting to have all this interaction too, and the answers are gonna be there. So let's start with our Q&A session. If you like, I'd like to invite to our virtual stage Deborah Gordon, and she's a senior principal in the Climate Intelligence Program at Rocky Mountain Institute, where she's leading the Oil and Gas Solutions Initiative. And Jules Kortenhorst, the head of Rocky Mountain Institute, was unable to join us today for personal reasons, and Deborah has stepped in the last minute. So thank you again, Deborah. It is very nice of you. So to warm up, could you give us an overview on Rocky Mountain Institute's actions to fight climate change, including the problem of methane emissions? Could you give us a quick overview on that?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Vanessa. So overall, Rocky Mountain Institute is working on all energy systems, and we see this as a very decisive decade. The focus is to cut in half greenhouse gases by 2030 in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change, some of which we've already started to see in the last several years, the devastation that has happened. And in the Climate Intelligence Program, we're working on visualizing these methane and CO2 emissions, doing attribution and analysis in order to develop market structures that can activate green finance.
That's very interesting. And Deborah, we are talking about methane emissions, and we just said that it is the missing part of this conversation. So why is methane such a big problem and why it has played in the background until now?
So methane emissions are in their volume smaller than CO2. Everything we do in the global economy emits CO2. Every time we burn a fossil fuel, it's very large volumes of CO2. So for the last generation, maybe even longer, the focus has been squarely on CO2. The issue, though, is that methane emissions are now growing, so that's becoming a problem. And as soon as they're emitted, they're 120 times more impactful than CO2. So if you imagine a blanket on over the earth, warming it, and that one blanket is CO2, methane would be 120 blankets. So its impact is vastly more. That says that if we avoid methane in the first place, right, and stop it from being emitted, you've actually done the equivalent of removing 120 tons of CO2. So it's hugely beneficial. And it also forces us to look at very rapid mitigation on methane. Anything we can do to reduce methane has an immediate impact or benefit to the climate. We have to still work on CO2, but methane is now a much higher priority since we've seen these disasters increase.
Your answer was very visual and it was a little bit scary too in that sense. So and we know that methane is a big problem, and it comes from many sources. So it comes from wetlands, livestock production, agricultural activities. So but we are always talking about the oil and gas industry in that sense. And why are we focused on this specific source of emissions?
Yeah, I think it's little known, which is interesting because it's such a fundamental thing, that natural gas is comprised mostly of methane. So when you think of natural gas going to your stove, going to your building, going to the utility sector for your electricity, that is methane. It's one thing to have that natural gas methane, which comes out of oil and gas systems. It's one thing to have it closed in your system all the way to the end use, where then you burn it and it generates CO2. The problem is it's very leaky. It leaks in production, it leaks in shipping, it leaks in liquefied natural gas, and it leaks in consumptions and pipelines. It leaks everywhere. These systems aren't closed, and that is the biggest problem. It, I also wanted to say that it doesn't leak equally. That's the opportunity side of what we're talking about today. So some oil and gas systems are tighter and more closed than others. And those that are leaky, that difference can be a factor of 10 between the cleanest, least leaky system and a dirtier system. And some super emitting systems can leak 100 times more than the cleanest systems. Now, that problem is exactly what we're talking about today, because it is the opportunity of green finance, because markets love to differentiate commodities. That's when they trade most effectively. So if you can separate the least leaky from the most leaky systems, which is the MiQ standard, you've ended up creating this opportunity for the market to do something about it.
It is so, and how easy it is to fix the leak. So such a leaky system, either the big leakage and also the smallest one that I imagine that it's harder to detect, right?
Well, it's interesting that methane is invisible and it's odorless at the source and it's tiny and it's under pressure. So it's like all the worst things that force it to come out of its closed system. It wants to get out into the atmosphere. And often the operators don't know that it's leaking. Not all operators are bad actors. It's a really hard one. You can't see it, you can't smell it. It's very hard to detect. That's where the satellites and other projects, Carbon Mapper, that RMI is working on come in to help this. But the idea, the notion that it can be found, it can be sensed, and it can be monitored, and it can be reduced is really hopeful. IEA, the International Energy Agency, has studied the technological potential of reducing these emissions. 75% of oil and gas emissions can be technologically reduced, and almost half of those, 40%, are cost effective to reduce, because the less methane you leak, the more methane gets to the end user, to a buyer, and you can monetize it. So you don't really, you're wasting money when you leak methane. And almost half of the emissions in oil and gas can be, you can financially recoup the investment that you've made stopping it from leaking in the first place.
And if you look at the commodities markets right now, it's pretty expensive, that product, to be wasted. So I'd imagine that corporations would be very interested in addressing this issue. So why are we here now? Why corporations don't seem to be resolving the problem now?
Well, there's the overriding goal of this oil and gas sector has always been to just churn out these products as quickly as possible. And in the past, it was all about economics and technology. I think that the focus over more and more has been on climate as well. And now they have to rethink how to triangulate the technology, the operations, the economics of it, and the ESG, the environmental, society, governance, and the climate part of this equation. Some are ahead of others. Again, that's why green finance is great. It will differentiate which operators are better than others. We're hopefully going to transform this energy system, but the best operators should be the ones that remain, the ones that are most responsible. So that's really where MiQ comes in, to differentiate natural gas and start to be able to measure the intensity, talk about corporate practices, who's doing the most, and then verify and monitor to say it's not just about talking about what you're doing, it's about actually achieving what you said that you're doing.
You mentioned differentiation and transparency then. So transparency comes from that. And I would imagine that, so you do have this partnership, right, with MiQ. And my question is that the main target with this partnership is find a way to differentiate? And how would that evolve?
Yeah, so RMI and Systemic have partnered up on really this deep dive on differentiating natural gas in oil and gas systems in terms of their methane emissions. It's a great partnership because RMI is everything technology on that side of the technology equation. And Systemic is really great in terms of the market side. Although I have to say, everyone on the team has some background in oil and gas, very pragmatic group. The idea of traders and those that have been on the oil and gas production end, like I was early in my career, and putting this all together means that we really understand these operations, which makes this very, the potential for it to succeed is far greater. And it has these three levels. George will go into more detail on it, but the idea of quantifying the methane intensity of various gas streams that come out for those that produce gas, we'll build this into shipping and midstream processing, and then also LNG. Right now it's in production, but then attaching to that a grade on your company's practices, how well you've set up your system to operate cleanly and low methane, and then being able to monitor this so that this can be verified, that these companies are actually achieving what they've said they've done. It's designed to be tightened. Graded gas, A through F, will be tightened over time, so we'll get cleaner and cleaner. And as one of my Systemic colleagues likes to say, if we're very successful, we'll be obsolete. The goal is to ultimately get off oil and gas, but in the meantime, we've got this huge opportunity to stop leaking this oil and gas that goes in huge volumes all over the globe.
And it's all about the supply chain too, right? It needs to be all over the supply chain.
Yeah.
So we also hear a lot about many ways to talk about reducing emissions, right? Net zero emissions, net zero climate neutral, net zero carbon neutral. Which one do you pick?
I think the word carbon has been very confused, even to me, and I've been doing this for my whole career. But when you say carbon, you really mean carbon containing compounds. That includes methane, that includes black carbon, that includes HFCs, the fluorinated gases, CO2, of course, but I think that's often a confusion in all of this. And so the idea of remembering that this is really about greenhouse gases, those blankets on the climate that are going to be the most important thing, and understanding what the priority should be for any given group. It's going to take all oars in. I think that the words are less important than the intention and the actual deliverable in all of this. So I hope that folks remember that this CO2 will always be important. This is this is our century problem, like you said at the outset, but we're going to have to start to really focus in on short-lived climate pollutants, these super pollutants like methane, to give us that leg up right now.
It is interesting because, as you said, it does offer an opportunity. So thank you very much, Deborah, for this very interesting answers and your collaboration. That was, I think, that sets the tone for our panel. And just a friendly reminder for everyone, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions during the panel. We're going to be very happy to get your questions, and probably we're going to be able to answer most of them, hopefully. So let me now introduce to our panelists. I am very happy to be with all of you here today. I will call each one of you, and you have 3 minutes for a short introduction. So the first one to be called is Zoe Knight. She's a group head, HSBC Center of Sustainable Finance. So please take our digital stage here, Zoe, and you do have 3 minutes to introduce yourself and give us your main message.
Thank you, Vanessa, and I'm delighted to be joining you all this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, to talk about methane. So just to give you all a little bit of context about what I do at HSBC. So I set up the Centre of Sustainable Finance 3 years ago to really work across HSBC's activities on 2 critical factors. One is looking at how the real economy will transform itself to decarbonize in response to the climate challenge. So looking at energy systems and thinking past the easy solutions of scaling up renewable capacity, which of course we still have more work to do there, but is a well-known solution to the problem. So thinking about how more complex sectors can work on decarbonisation pathways, such as steel, cement, oil and gas, shipping, aviation, and so on. And to do that, we partner with a variety of academics, industry associations, and others to try and work through what the best way forward is in those sectors. The second thing we look at is the mobilization of capital and how we really accelerate financing into this space. And that's by looking at the entire financial system response. So on the opportunity side, what sort of factors are being put in place to drive investment? So transparency around activity categorization, working with the EU in terms of taxonomy and classification of activities. And things like looking at more comprehensive risk assessment. So the central banks that are doing stress testing, the network for greening the financial system and looking at scenarios, and thinking about how to mobilize both the opportunity side of investment, given that we need to invest around 6.9 trillion a year for our infrastructure needs, and we need to do that in a way that doesn't lock us into a high carbon future. And also thinking about the risk factors. And given that HSBC's global footprint is across 60 countries, and of course, the financing that we provide is globally relevant, there's a lot of work to do on a country by country basis. So the Centre is really a think tank that works on the global climate problem, but then collaborates closely with regional colleagues to figure out what is most relevant for their countries. And so this is really important for the climate solution, right? Because we know very extensively at the global level what to do. It's all about decarbonisation of the energy supply and becoming much more energy efficient. But on a country by country, case by case basis, we know from the plans that were put forward for the Paris Agreement that what the nationally determined contributions are pointing towards don't add up to that 2-degree goal. And so on a country by country basis, we're working with local governments, with local academics and others to really drill into the barriers to solving climate. Now that may come from the need to de-risk a certain industry, like facilitate the enabling environment to scale up off-grid capacity, for instance, or it may come from financial incentives. And I think that's where our success comes from. It's from taking that global knowledge and taking best practice from different regions and exporting it across the network. So that's an intro. I think I'm going to go back into the financial system in a little bit more detail in terms of what we can do for methane in a second. But back to you, Vanessa.
Thank you very much. It's an exciting job. Now I'm handing it to George Tischbosch. He is a senior advisor at MiQ. So please, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Yeah, indeed. Good afternoon, everybody in Europe. Maybe there's some people from Asia on the line as well. Will be the evening, and good morning, the Americas. So thanks as well, Debbie. You've already provided quite a good intro on MiQ, which I'll try to continue a bit. So yeah, we set it up by now more than a year and a half ago as an independent and global, but also not-for-profit partnership between RMI and Systemic. And really our goal is to address methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. And the reason is it's got a massive impact, and we talked a bit about some of the numbers. And we'll probably go more into some of the numbers over the days, and especially with the UN report coming out, that might change some of the numbers out there as well, which will be very interesting. And one of the reasons why we want to address is, with the existing technology, a vast majority can be addressed reasonably within a limited timescale. And we think we can probably save around 5.7 gigatons, billion tons of methane emissions by the end of this decade, which is a gigantic number. It's around 100 billion trees to be planted every year, equivalency. And of course, some companies have made voluntary actions on this, and we can see that some go further with public statements, or have clearly, there's very good operators out there as well. And some of the regulators are starting to look into this. But we thought there was absolutely an opportunity for a much more market-based approach. And we're doing this with a methane emissions performance standards through a concept called certification. What that will lead to ultimately is transparency. And I think that's, and I'll come to that, that's what investors require, that's what the operators themselves require, the regulators, everybody actually. And that transparency is not there. Like Debbie eloquently phrased it, it's a small molecule, it just escapes, you can't see it. So what you can't measure, what you don't know, is very difficult to manage currently. And that's really what we want to address. And so ultimately it will lead to differentiated gas, because you'll be able to differentiate an A-rated, we call it A-graded, very clean gas from methane emissions perspective, to the F grades. And for those of you familiar with the rest of the commodity sector, that's exactly the same as what's happened in the diesel world, for example, with dealing with sulfur emissions. People distinguish the different grades in there, and the industry has taken up the challenge to deal with it and invest in the right technologies. So I don't know if the other thing is we made recently two really exciting announcements in the US. We announced two projects. The first one was with EQT, which is North America's biggest gas producer, produce close to 5% of the US gas production. And we'll look to certify 200 well pads there. And that's a volume of 4 BCF a day. And for the rest of the world, that means 41 BCM a year, which is a very large quantity that we're looking to certify. And then also last week, we announced with Northeast Natural Energy, we're going to be looking to certify their facilities. So what you can see is this is taking off, and we were very excited about those initial announcements, and obviously looking forward to more of them. We're doing both of those projects with Equitable Origin, and they will certify the energy companies on the ESG indicators. So it's a wider than purely the methane in these two cases. Now, why is this important for the investors? Well, I think it's actually crucial, the role the investors can play here, because obviously you have huge leverage with the oil companies, the operators in the investments, and there's a variety of ways, of course. When we're talking about dealing with the GHG emissions drive, and that's what Debbie alluded to as well. We're talking about net zero. What is exactly net zero? And unfortunately, methane has been forgotten a bit lately. Well, rather in the past. And what we are seeing now, it is being addressed, and obviously that's where the importance comes in. And I think if we were to rank sectors, like industrial sectors, on what GHG impact can we have in that specific sector versus the feasibility of execution by 2030, then addressing the methane emissions in the oil and gas sector would definitely be top 3 of projects one would look at and get on with it. And obviously we've seen some buyers like Engie and Pavilion, and the regulators like the EU starting to look into this and putting the pressure on there. But yeah, we'd like to count on the investor community to pick this up. We're providing the tool to create that transparency, because you're going to need that. Otherwise, how do you ask the questions? That's kind of what we look forward to, debating a bit further here as well. Back to you, Vanessa.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you. Now I'm going to hand over to John Bromley, Head of Clean Energy Strategy, Legal and General Capital.
Hi, hello everybody, whatever time of day and wherever you are. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me. The first thing I'm going to say is to be completely honest, that sitting on the panel today and being part of this event, I'm here actually because I'm learning a lot about methane, and certainly for the investments in the part of our group that I invest on behalf of, which is very focused on clean energy investments in the private markets. We are those private market investments are targeted on being net zero now. So it's all about renewables, clean tech, and helping to grow businesses in the heat and the e-mobility space. So for an investor that's like myself, very focused in that area, I think it's really important to bring the attention of that constituency to this particular issue, because frankly, we can invest a lot of money trying to avoid using up what's left of the carbon budget for a 1.5 world. But actually, if we are leaking a whole load of methane and effectively sort of foregoing some of the investment benefits that we're actually trying to achieve with that investment in clean energies, then that's really not a very sort of holistic approach to investment. So I'm here to learn like everybody else, but also have sort of a clear perspective on why I think this is really important and it should have a lot more attention. And the final thing I'd say is that Legal and General, whilst I'm investing for private markets from our balance sheet and trying to sort of be involved in accelerating the transition, what a large part of our group is also responsible for is, as one of the biggest asset managers in Europe, is how to invest the pensions and savings schemes of sort of millions of customers and clients. And that's the part of our business where we have a very, very strong focus around the E, the S and the G, and we actively participate, we actively get involved and air those concerns and look for progress. And we want to see real action when we engage with the boards of sort of major companies across industry, across the economy. And so I think, as George has pointed to there, sort of bringing tools and capabilities that can bring transparency to what is really actually going on in the real world with those assets, and helping to report and bring data that once it's known and it can be measured, people will start managing it and monitoring it. I think these are real fundamentals for good ESG sort of management and allocations going forward. So hopefully that's a bit of a picture from me, and looking forward to learning alongside all of you today. Back to you, Vanessa.
We're going to learn a lot from you too, definitely. Now I'd like to ask for Thomas Kenzie, Director at Vivid Economics. Finally, can you introduce yourself, Thomas?
Sure, Vanessa, thank you very much. So yeah, I'm Thomas Kenzie, I'm a Director at Vivid Economics, a McKinsey company, and I'm based in London and work quite for the last decade on all things climate. And so with this, I'm just incredibly pleased that methane is really taking center stage. Really from the big pivot to gas and the IEA flagship report on this, where in the end gas might not be as clean and renewables also becoming rapidly competitive. in many markets, to work that we did on our inevitable policy response program for investors with the principles for responsible investments, where we lifted up gas emissions to really account for underestimated methane leakage, and it was a controversial call to make at some point, to now what we have the better measurement with the initiatives today here at MiQ, but also EDF and others playing a major role in this, where it really comes to carbon neutral commodities in the future. And really, in my view, the market is ripe to account for and reduce methane. That's the key thing. And this is also where investors come in. And I just wanted to flag 2 key points on this. So on the measurement, of course, it's what you own and what you finance. Remembering really that what gets measured gets managed. And that is good because you know what you actually have, but when it gets managed, you run into carbon neutral commodities, carbon border adjustment, and various other policy measures that I think are inevitable to come in that will create and reshuffle value in there as well. So for investors, it's important where you position yourself. And the second one is really on the investment side afterwards. Now we have measured it. How do we manage it? So how to reduce these emissions? How do we maintain the license to operate of these assets? And how do investors get a slice of the upside in there as well? Because it is a massive market. It will require big investment. And as I said, it will reshuffle value significantly. So on the measurement side, we already spoken about all the certification and the rating, and MiQ is really central to this. It provides that transparency. Already, Deborah, you mentioned, oil and gas is about 1/4 of global methane emissions. And we also know where it is coming from with Middle East, US, but also Russia and across Africa as main emissions. We need to first, on the measurement side, maintain that we really have broad coverage and cover all activities, venting, leaks, incomplete combustion and flaring. We also need to look at inactive wells, which is sort of a legacy one that we need to take care of, because when you stop owning the asset in a way, it doesn't stop for investors necessarily. And we need to be able to account for one-off events like that well that blew out in Ohio sometime in 2018 that was just releasing so much methane in the atmosphere. And this is great because we already have, to some extent, the oil and gas methane partnership in there with its 2.0 framework and the EU methane strategy that just went off, or consultation just closed on this. And really, one of the things for investors to ensure here as well is, and what these initiatives do well, is they account for really the methane across the value chain, so also joint ventures, which gets important, which becomes important, where you see oil and gas majors starting to change joint ventures into a joint venture structure many times for carbon accounting purposes. And that makes it a bit easier for investors to afterwards say, hey, we reduced emissions, whereas in reality, it hasn't achieved anything yet. So we'll need, those measurements. We'll need to watch out for what happens afterwards once we measure this. Carbon border adjustments will come in. We definitely want to differentiate commodities based on their emissions intensity. And carbon neutral commodities will become a major driver of this. So that's exactly what we have here. So for investors, it's, what is your process when you ask the companies? How do you measure, how do you track and disclose your emissions? Are you signed up to the oil and gas methane partnership framework? And are you going to the tier 3 of the EU methane strategy? And how do you prepare yourself for the response to the policy response that is coming to this and that is inevitable? How do you prepare yourself for carbon border adjustments, for carbon neutral commodities? Then on the investment side, that's exactly the other side of the coin. When you've asked all those questions as an investor, then it is, hey, where are the opportunities in this? And so one is, of course, methane itself is a primary component of natural gas. And so there's always value to be captured from it. Whether you use vapor recovery units and process this into natural gas liquids, or put it back into the market, or use it for energy on site, there's always some value in there. And then in the future, when carbon prices rise, etc., as well, for hydrogen creation, etc. So that's really what we need to do. And Deborah already flagged that we can see 40% reduction rather cost effectively. And that's the first thing that we need to have. We need to measure this. We need to invest into the reduction technologies. So again, here for investors, asking one of the companies, what's your plan to do this? Identifying what the solutions are that are technically feasible. The IEA already does a great job of that, and other initiatives, but which are also economically feasible. And then also how to participate in that value chain as an investor. Do you want to buy a methane measurement company? Do you want to invest into scaling one that does provides leak detection and repair services, etc.? So there's quite a bit that you can do for the companies that you invest in, as well as for investors yourself on what you want to create with it, or provide methane capture as a service, for example. So there's various routes to markets. So again, anything that you start to measure, you reshuffle value. And it's for investors about being prepared on the downside. Will these companies still have my social license to operate, essentially? And will they be competitive if we put carbon neutral commodities and all the measurements on this? And if not, what can we actually do to help them transition and have a real impact on the ground?
There are many ways, many routes. We need to pick one or some of them and make it happen. That's basically very interesting, Thomas. Thank you. As we are talking about financing and these challenges on what route to pick and who to be involved with and the supply chain and everything that our panelists really were able to really address during the introductory speeches. My first question goes to John. So John, you talked about real action. And I think Thomas just talked about that too. Maybe all of you have touched in this point at some moment in your speeches. But so how important it is to certify projects with low and in terms of methane emissions, methane footprint, from the financing access point of view? I mean, would that help you, for example, to select what projects to get support? How can you help me to understand a little bit more about that, John?
Yeah, well, I mean, fundamentally, sort of, why is it important to distinguish between assets that are doing doing what they're currently doing in an effective and a very efficient way, and minimising their impact, and those assets that are not doing things in that same way, are not minimising their impact. So I think, apart from any other reason, increasingly as investors are looking for managers that will that are taking careful consideration of some of these environmental sort of impacts of their investments and where their money is being used. It's really important that you can actually demonstrate to them exactly what that means. And so to the extent that there are investments in, for example, in oil and gas companies, and we are wanting to sort of see what their plans are to improve and to go on a journey that needs this transition towards a net zero world. It's really important that actually when we challenge them for what actions are you taking and what are you actually doing in your assets out in the world to actually make those differences and deliver on those changes, that we can actually point to tools and methods by which we can firstly hold them to account on it, but secondly so that they actually know themselves what that problem is. And I think I could take a much wider view as well and say that that there's often discussion, for example, where we are in Europe at the moment, about repurposing gas mains and distribution in the future for use in hydrogen. Now, people will immediately tell you the challenges of hydrogen being very leaky, small molecule gas. So there are kind of multi-layer reasons why actually getting a real handle on what are the leakage problems and what is the kind of the status of assets is always a value. It's a value to all utilities if they're going to have efficient operations, and as we should hopefully see in the near future, as we properly start to price carbon and its impacts, then actually it will become, it should be, I hate the phrase, but it should be an absolute no-brainer for the companies that really want to lead the way and still have people buying their gas, which is going to happen for a good period on all projections to net zero. That actually they will want to show that they are leading the way in the transition. So, fundamental that there are some tools out there to enable this to happen, and investors, want to be able to see tools that they can actually understand how they work, what they're doing, what results they're producing, and then how they can actually use those results to inform their investment decisions.
It's going to make your life also easier in that sense, the investment side. Now, just following up on this idea, Zoe, you also talked about the market-based approach. And my question is, and you mentioned also the HSBC global presence, right? So what role exactly do financing institutions have in this global efforts to reduce methane emissions, and how it differentiate between regions? When we're going to talk about poor countries, third world countries, or very well developed countries, what is the difference in that sense?
So, I mean, finance is critical because how we deploy capital determines the future route of the economy, right? So if we are today not correctly factoring in the climate risk perspective from both the physical side as temperatures are getting warmer, but also the policy implementation side as governments move to incentivize change to meet their net zero commitments. If we're not deploying capital in that right way, then we're taking on excessive risks, and we're not financing the opportunity. So in order to do both things, we really need to understand how the various sector drivers are going to play out. But what we can do, and what we are doing as an industry, is helping to bring transparency to those financial flows. And this is a point that several others on the panel have brought up today, this piece around disclosure and transparency. And the labeled financial products that we're seeing growth in, so the likes of the green bonds, the sustainability linked bonds and loans, and these markets are really critical for investors, but also for governments to demonstrate that they're actually deploying capital in a way that meets the policy goals or the nationally determined contributions that they're setting out. So just to give you some indicator, in 2020, the green and sustainability linked market doubled from 2019. And in the first 4 months of this year, we saw half the issuance of 2020. So 2021 is shaping up to be a good year, but what's changed in these markets is that the hard to abate sectors, so those that don't have a clear-cut pathway of emission reduction, like oil and gas, aviation, shipping, are linking their sustainability labeled products to emission reduction KPIs. So this is particularly relevant for methane, because if, for example, financing is linked to methane reduction targets, then you start to provide transparency on how the problem is being addressed, and you start to give investors clarity on being able to see that the finance is steering things in the right direction. So it's really important for us to try and drive those markets forward, and we're seeing that in different regions. I think Europe in particular has been the leader in labeled products, but Asia is catching up fast. And I think that's because now there is this global effort in relation to climate ambition, which is translating through into the financing requirements. So as global organizations such as ourselves, and there are very many others that are involved in this space, can use that best practice leverage in different areas, then we can start to scale up investment faster. We can start to understand risks much more effectively and factor them in and make the cost of capital cheaper in certain regions. And that is helpful in bringing more projects to market in a commercially viable way.
Yeah, it is. I see when you are talking about, there's an example, and a good example, which is Africa. I see there is some discussion here in the chat. Thank you all for sending your questions using our Q&A function to ask your questions. Very useful. And maybe a follow-up on that, Zoe, is exactly, so you're talking about, this huge investments going on in Africa right now, and the impact that it's going to have in methane emissions. And so the question is really, how do you think the extraction will contribute to Africa's climate change goals? you know, how those investments can impact in that sense in countries that we know have a lot of economic, social, and political challenges.
So Africa is not an area that we look at particularly closely at HSBC, but in the context of the global climate agenda, clearly each country has brought to the table its own plans on what it can do in relation to its nationally determined contributions. What we have seen is efforts to de-risk capital by launching blended finance instruments. And that has been successful in, well, Asian countries, but also North African countries as well. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you can expect to see more of that, and you can expect to see a leapfrog mechanism in place whereby those learnings that we've had for the last sort of 5, 6, 7 years, you kind of, the lessons learned from what works and what doesn't can be very directly applied to emerging regions in Africa.
Very interesting. It's also challenging there. So moving from Africa to the US a little bit, if you allow me, there's another question from the audience about how financial companies and if they are pressuring for legislation. And I think it's a very interesting question. It talks about so the audience is asking specifically if financial companies are starting making loud public push in support of legislation that enforce financial companies to drive the fight against climate change in the US. But we could also broaden that topic to other countries, not only the US, because I think legislation is missing all over the world in that direction. So it might be also a question to John. John, could you take this one? Could you pick this one up?
Yeah, well, how about I pick it up as a start? But I suspect that actually everybody would have something to add. So I'll be fairly brief, but and I'll speak to just start with. I'll speak from my experience. It's quite UK focused, but actually, without a more global perspective, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing in the UK. Look, it's a tricky one because there's a circle that we go around here of policy. It takes time for policy to start to converge and for agreements to be reached. And I think what we saw certainly in Paris in COP21 was probably the most comprehensive was the most comprehensive agreement on climate to that point. Now that sort of that's an important milestone because it creates a signal for investors that, look, there is a direction of travel here. It's getting broader constituency globally and amongst the political amongst political players and actors. And therefore, we can see that there is an opportunity for policy, for regulation, and for finance, all to start to converge on actually making progress and actually getting things to be done. And I think at any one time, one constituency is trying to push the other to go further or quicker or harder. But I think what we've been very pleased to see in the UK is that I think it's been a very sort of two-way street. And I think we've possibly the pandemic the COVID pandemic has had some ramifications for this, because I think we won't be alone in the UK and Europe, but I think globally people very quickly see that governments alone without quick agility and stepping up across the private sector and finances and industry across the board, it needed all actors to actually start to get us through that challenge and to play an important role in all parts of it. I think that's where we're at with climate change now. I think it's great we've actually got that we often say race to zero. I sort of think it's taken us 20 years to get everybody to the start line, but we should be realistic. We are actually just for the first time all at the start line. We now need to sort of take everybody on the run, and it's definitely not a race because we don't achieve this thing until we've all crossed the line. So there are some really strong parallels for me with the pandemic, but I think that's so important that you can't take everybody across the line unless you have, really a much more open door and conversation between investors, their shareholders, their customers, their clients, and society. And all of that means it's really important to politicians, and it's important that we're strongly engaged with politicians, and that's what we do. I think we sort of say, look, you're going to need us and more of this private finance to help achieve some of these goals, but actually there are some, we're actually keen to push things. We want to be ambitious, and we want to make sure that we're not financing sort of a future that that falls short. So I think it's definitely a two-way street. I said I'd be brief, and I probably haven't been, so I'll be quiet and let others come in, because I think it's a rich area to discuss.
Yeah. I will take your idea and I will throw the ball to Thomas, because so we just seen like Europe adopting the methane strategy last year, and we just mentioned. So first of all, Thomas, there's two questions in one. Do you believe that financial companies are now being more present in pushing members of Congress in the US or in the European Commission in Europe to pass such legislation? And do you think the European methane strategy is going to work? What it takes?
Yeah. No, I mean, look, the proof's in the pudding for this one, right? The key KPIs for this one is really about, do we have evidence-based, a good evidence-based to actually achieve mitigation on this? And the second part, is it cost efficient? Because it's easy to say, hey, we're just going to tackle everything and we just go up the full curve and we go for this full 70%. And then you become very prescriptive, then it's complete command and control. That is very challenging to do. And that will also not be the model that will be adopted somewhere else. So those are sort of like the KPIs in there. I think that the tiering standard that they have in there and that they try together with the oil and gas methane partnership is really important. And the goal, to go to the tier 3, sort of the highest tier, standard adoption soon is great. The key thing of this afterwards is really about rolling this one out across other jurisdictions. And then learning the lessons from possibly, Canada, the US, with lots of oil and gas, and transferring that knowledge onto the other oil and gas producers, essentially. And that will be incremental improvement, because I think someone pointed this out in the Q&A as well. The measurement side of it still isn't entirely great. There's still gaps to be filled in there. There's still parts where it will get very challenging to get to tier 3. So there's lots of new things to come. There's lots of innovation still to come on this. And that's where we need joint effort. We need technology exchange on this and knowledge exchange on this, essentially. And that needs to be rolled out across the key jurisdictions. And then tying in this with the Africa question earlier, Africa has the ability to leapfrog on this to some extent, learning the lessons on how do we actually build better gas infrastructure to actually deliver on the lower emissions intensity that natural gas promises, while still delivering, the energy needs. And it's not a small feat. I mean, Nigeria is projected to have more people than Europe as a whole by 2050. And so it's not a small feat to provide energy for so many people, and that's just one country. And so that would be very important. Then the other part is it's really about the leak detection and avoidance equipment that needs to be moving a lot faster, and there should be a lot more innovation in this. I think at the moment when you look at this, it's who's taking the investment on this? It's actually the oil and gas companies with their venture arms. That will be one of the things where investors can play an additional role and basically say, hey, we want to operate in this, or we'll encourage the companies to spend more on this, essentially. That's, I think, one of the other parts. And then the last part of this is really, for me, what the EU strategy is there, really to eliminate routine venting and flaring and covering the full supply chain on this. This really is one of the priorities. I mean, in my personal view, the EU strategy for the EU by 2030 is not as ambitious as it should be. And so there's more to be done, because again, this is one of the easy gains afterwards. And I think again, it provides new business models. If you want to, right now you do flaring basically because you can't use the gas any other way. That's what you do, because you're actively destroying value, and you're creating some value by not, having that much temperature increase, but you're still actively destroying value of the during the flaring. So it's about how do we actually make use for this? What kind of modular options can we provide in the future? And I've seen, people trying to put this then afterwards into, into ammonia, into hydrogen, do on-site natural gas liquids, etc. It just, that requires just a bit more innovation. Once you have people saying that this is value that you're destroying, someone will grab that value and actually make something of it. And that's the incentive, and that's probably where we need investors. It's not the institutional investors on this, it's different type of capital, right? This is venture capital going into this, but it plays also a big role, because while we have HSBC and all the big ones here, we'll need to look across the chain on the risk appetite of them as well, because they all play different roles in this. So long story short, there's lots of opportunity for investors on this.
But you mentioned that European Union should take a step further, right, in this strategy in order to. I always ask if Europe can be considered as an example for other countries after this methane emissions strategy, and you were mentioning also how challenging it is now. It is. The European Commission is also thinking about a volunteering approach. So letting natural gas companies and oil and gas companies to volunteer to that. What do you think about it? Do you think it can work in that sense, or it needs to be enforced by everyone?
Look, I mean, when it becomes a bit of a philosophical question as well. I mean, I do think that many oil and gas companies want to be good stewards of the environment. And I do think that they want to signal to their shareholders and actually have, a positive environmental impact and, provide clean, reliable, safe energy. There is always that in there. So volunteering in this, perfectly fine. And as I said, many of the reduction measures are not very costly. So it's not that big of a leap, essentially. You're still working on the goodwill of people, essentially. So that's always has a slower uptake rate than when you mandate it. You can go further on this, but you also need to balance competing objectives with this, and you also need to balance, if you have all of the measurement, like you have EU producers, or in the US, like very good California producers, and then suddenly they are being pitted against ones that have just more measurement uncertainty and therefore get assigned an average value and so forth, then you're creating an uneven playing field. So you have to carefully balance what you mandate and how you want people to develop this. So, I mean, coming to your question, I do think there's very good faith players in this space that want to do something about this. And so encouraging them on this is fantastic. So, I mean, you can't go wrong when you encourage them to be better.
Can I maybe pick up on that as well, Vanessa? And,
Go ahead, George.
Yeah, because I fully agree there with Thomas on the need for voluntary actions. In a way that's kind of what we are proposing with the MiQ system. So the deals we've just announced in the US are forms of voluntary action where companies have decided, I'm going to certify, I'm going to be very clear about my methane emissions in a very credible way. And we think that that's the way this will develop. But what it will also do, it will give a framework, a methodology, a clarity to the regulators like the EU, for example, of what is actually possible and what's out there. Because from a regulatory perspective, it's actually quite complex to regulate this, because how are you going to regulate something you actually don't really know? And in many cases, like let's take the EU, it's outside of the EU. So there's a whole complexity around regulating this. And so the MiQ system we've designed, it's based on starting on a voluntary measure, on a voluntary basis. And again, companies are now going with this, and we hope investors will pick this up. But equally, we're also looking for the regulators potentially to adopt it over time and kind of then put whatever different measures around it, but they're needing something to work with. And currently that isn't there yet. They're going to need something to measure against to get this kick started. And again, that's happened in other commodities markets in the past. But for methane, because it's such an invisible problem, you first need to set up that framework. And what we can see from including conversations with the regulators, a lot of people in the regulatory space are struggling with coming up with something that could work. And so what we hope to do is provide that example in practice, get it going, including with the companies that are more progressive on this and want to get going on this, and that's fast growing. And then from there, hopefully the regulators take it up and accelerates it away, because that will come. The regulators will want to get involved on this. I'm convinced of that.
Very interesting. You mentioned US and Australia. They're all also big players in the LNG markets. And we are hearing not about innovation in the LNG markets. Do you think so? Do you think that those innovations, how it will impact methane emissions, and how do methane emissions relate to those innovations?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the LNG market, obviously, first of all, LNG is not necessary, is already a step further in the whole supply chain. So you have to start with the upstream production. And that is, according to our research, where the vast majority of the emissions take place. But then you obviously have liquefaction, transport, and regas coming in the end. But the larger majority is taking place in the LNG. Next week, so we are looking at the whole supply chain here with our concepts. And next week, so currently we've started with the highest priority, which is the upstream part. Next week, we'll announce a partnership with an LNG consultant to determine the methane emissions of that. And then it will become another module that we're including, so that somewhere in the summer, we can actually deal with the whole chain. And what that will probably mean is that from an LNG perspective, you can then compare LNG facilities with each other, LNG deliveries with each other. And that's what's needed. And for example, you've seen the Engie cancellation of their contracts last November, I think it was, for the US, because it creates a problem for the likes of an Engie to buy natural gas with basically unknown methane emissions for whatever, I think it was a 25-year contract from memory. So they need that transparency again. And they need the methodology behind it. So I think that's where the innovation will come. Once these numbers are out there, then the cleaner ships are going to be the preferred one, the same for the facilities, the same for the regas. And then it comes back to the points that Thomas is making. Then the different technology providers will come in. They now have pricing signals to work against.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, George. It's a lot. We're talking a lot about how these carbon neutral projects can get along, get financed, and just make things happen. Time is flying, and we're almost out of it now. So I'd like to make a roundup here and ask each panelist for the one thing you hope the audience takes away from this conversation in one sentence. I will start with my first victim, George.
Oh no. Surprise, I'm setting the tone here.
What is the one thing?
Can I make it two? No, I probably can't, but anyway, one of them will be stated by the rest of the audience. But methane, I think people are realizing is important in oil and gas. Is like super impactful, basically. But we can address it with a transparent system like MiQ. And I hope the audience takes that away. And I want the oil and gas industry just to get on with it. And it is now possible.
Great, George. Zoe?
Transparency. So transparency and reporting of emissions from methane, and then transparency of how solutions to reduce methane are financed.
John?
Yeah, absolutely second both of those first comments. And I'd actually just very simply say that, for all investors like me out there that are sort of very focused on the investing in the new zero emission technologies, etc., all investors involved in that should have, we should all be aware of and have an interest in seeing that methane leakage and wastage is a really important issue for all of us, and it will ultimately, it could have sort of implications for the work that we're doing and what we can actually achieve with those investments. So it's a really important area, and we should be paying it more attention.
Thomas.
Yeah, first things first, what gets measured gets managed. So for investors, policymakers, and corporates, invest in, mandate, and deploy measurement equipment. That is number one priority. Once we have that sorted, then we can go into the reduction.
I hope you all are taking notes of all this. The takeaways were very interesting, and strong enough to close this section. I think we are approaching to the end of the discussion here. Thank you all for watching, sharing ideas, sending your very interesting questions that I could. You helped me to lead this panel it was very smooth because of the audience. So I also wanted to give a huge thanks to our panelists. They were great, all of them, and I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did. I always find these types of events to be re-energizing experience, and I always leave these sections with many thoughts in my mind. One of the insights that seemed to resonate within the audience was the transparency issue that you just talked about. Currently, there is no single global framework for measurement, reporting, verification of methane emissions. And a way to go is to progress in data, transparency. And I think governments, financial institutions, and companies have an important role. And our panelists just could explain that, how recognizing the problem and solving it, we can be on that way. And I hope we have more of these events to help us to think about it very soon. Thank you all again for your presence. Have a good day or have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you.